In the early hours of June 1st, an explosive piece of news emerged on the Mossad channel. Hamas leader Sinwar has been captured alive. This marks a significant victory for Israel in the latest round of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Starting on May 7th, the Israeli military began gathering near Rafah, a key Hamas stronghold, positioning tanks and soldiers in a siege stance. Netanyahu claimed that Rafah harbored thousands of Hamas militants, posing a significant threat to Israel's security and needing to be eradicated. Despite calls from the international community, including the United Nations, for Israel to show restraint, Netanyahu authorized a massive military operation, including airstrikes and ground assaults on Rafah. After weeks of fierce fighting, Israeli forces entered Rafah's urban area on May 28th. Biden proposed a new ceasefire initiative, but Israel decisively rejected it on May 31st. Currently, Israeli forces have withdrawn to the outskirts of Rafah, but 4 brigades remain in the city, continuing to root out remaining militants. According to Israeli military analysis, the Qassam Brigades, a Hamas subdivision, originally had 24 battalions, totaling about 30,000 fighters. Over 7 months of conflict, the Israeli army claims to have decimated 19 of these battalions, killing 14,000 fighters. Now, only 5 battalions remain, with fewer than 10,000 fighters. 4 battalions are concentrated in Rafah, while the 5th is in the central coastal area of Gaza. Israel believes that the bulk of the original 4 battalions in Rafah have moved to central Gaza. Approximately 2 Hamas battalions are still positioned in the Tar Sultan area west of Rafah. Israel's general strategy in Gaza is to capture, clear, and withdraw, typically not stationing troops permanently. Thus, despite Hamas forces in the north and central regions, scattered militants continue to resist. This approach, while reducing Israeli casualties, also gives Hamas a chance to regroup. Hamas still controls about 60% of Gaza's underground tunnels, using them to move troops and supplies. To completely eliminate Hamas, it's crucial to cut off their supplies. Currently, the remnants of Hamas in the tunnels are increasingly desperate. About 2/3 of Gaza's electricity comes from Israel, but supply was cut off at the outbreak of the conflict, plunging Hamas into darkness. Although Hamas stockpiled some food, water, and medicine before the war, and even diverted supplies from the United Nations intended for civilians, these reserves are now running low due to the fighting. Hamas urgently needs external aid, and China has reportedly urged Egypt to assist Hamas in obtaining supplies. In its operations in Gaza, Israel has opted for a precision strategy aimed at minimizing civilian casualties while gradually advancing. By employing precise airstrikes, blockades, and incremental tactics, Israel seeks to avoid being drawn into a full-scale war, reduce international condemnation, and undermine Hamas through a combination of military actions and psychological warfare. Initially, Israel conducted large-scale airstrikes in Gaza, forcing civilians to flee south. Then, using an incremental approach, they gradually took control of cities like Gaza, Khan Yunis, and Deir al-Balah, separating civilians from militants. Coupled with intelligence infiltration by Mossad to identify and eliminate Hamas members among civilians, Israel aims to dismantle Hamas's control gradually. The Gaza conflict traces its origins back to October 7, 2023, when Hamas launched an unprecedented full-scale attack on Israel from the sea, land, and air, more intense than any previous conflict. This onslaught resulted in the deaths of at least 100 Israeli civilians and the kidnapping of over 150 people by Hamas, marking a severe provocation against Israel. Hamas has long been a significant concern for Israel. Unlike Hezbollah and Syrian armed forces, Hamas is deeply rooted among the population of Gaza, with extensive military facilities hidden in densely populated areas. This makes military action challenging for Israel, as it risks harming civilians and drawing international condemnation. Hamas exploits this by frequently launching rockets at Israel, which, despite being largely intercepted by the Iron Dome system, still pose a significant security threat and psychological pressure on Israel. Israel has struggled to find the right opportunity and justification for large-scale military action. However, the October 7th incident became the catalyst for Israel to eliminate Hamas, setting the stage for subsequent military operations and signaling the eventual return of Gaza to Israeli control. As the battle for Rafah progresses, the geopolitical contest in the Middle East and globally enters a tug-of-war. During her visit to Israel on May 27th, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, explicitly blamed China, Russia, and Iran for the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel, claiming there was ample evidence. Haley, influential within the American Republican Party, reflected the widespread attitude among American conservatives. She stated that Hamas actions were orchestrated by Iran, supported by Russian intelligence, and financed and armed by China. This provided Israel with a justification for its military actions and highlighted the international ramifications of the conflict. For Israel, this large-scale military operation in Gaza also serves to clear obstacles for potential future actions against Iran. With Iran's president deceased and the country preoccupied with elections, its support for Hamas is expected to wane, presenting Israel with a rare opportunity to eradicate Hamas. Sensing Hamas's downfall, China quickly sought to rally Egypt, the UAE, and other Arab nations to diplomatically pressure Israel into a ceasefire. Chinese leader Xi Jinping expressed his deep concern over the Gaza situation to the Egyptian president, aiming to buy more time for Hamas. The Chinese Communist Party used the 20th anniversary of the China-Arab Cooperation Forum to host the 10th ministerial meeting in Beijing, inviting 22 Middle Eastern countries. Ostensibly promoting a two-state solution to establish independent Palestinian and Israeli states, China's underlying goal was to form an anti-Israel and anti-American Arab alliance. Bringing together so many countries was an attempt to prevent the collapse of the anti-American front. Without such efforts, Hamas's potential defeat could lead to Israeli dominance, undermining China's support for Hamas. The geopolitical maneuvering illustrates why the CCP is deeply invested in the conflict. Egypt's dilemma and Western strategy. China and Russia's greatest fear is the complete eradication of Hamas. Back in February, Egypt warned Israel against advancing on Rafah, threatening to tear up the 1979 Israel-Egypt peace treaty and deploy a large number of troops in the Sinai Peninsula. Despite these warnings, Israel continued its methodical and unimpeded advance, moving from Gaza to Khan Yunis and now to Rafah. The Gaza Strip is adjacent to the entrance of the Suez Canal, an area critical to the interests of the United States and Western countries. They will not allow Gaza to slip out of their sphere of influence. Regardless of the harsh methods Israel might employ to directly control Gaza, the United States and Western countries, while they may make humanitarian statements for appearances, ultimately share Israel's goal of maintaining tight control over Gaza. Middle Eastern countries are acutely aware of this geopolitical game. Calls for a ceasefire are largely performative. Behind the scenes, each nation is calculating its own interests. If other countries wanted to support Hamas, the power disparity between Israel and Hamas makes such assistance futile. As this grand drama unfolds, Israel's influence in the Middle East will likely increase, while Hamas faces the risk of total annihilation. The U.S. and Israel have a certain tolerance threshold for terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah. Israel had previously cooperated to some extent with Palestinian authorities and even Hamas, recognizing Hamas as the governing body of Gaza at one time. However, after Hamas crossed the red line with the October 7th terrorist attacks, Israel resolved to completely eliminate it. Hamas misused aid funds to build its terrorist infrastructure instead of properly managing Gaza, necessitating a severe response. The U.S. has a similar stance towards the Chinese Communist Party, advocating for its total eradication. Future geopolitical struggles. As the battle for Rafah continues, the geopolitical contest in the Middle East and globally is entering a tug-of-war stage. The coalition of the United States and its allies, including Anglo-Saxon countries, Jewish entities, and Catholic nations, while diverse, share a common commitment to universal values. They recognize that autocratic regimes in China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea, despite their outward strength, are riddled with internal contradictions and vulnerable to sustained external and internal pressure. The key is to strike at the right moment, aiming for a decisive blow that could unravel the opponent. If a critical member of the axis of evil collapses, it will likely trigger a domino effect, significantly impacting other members. For instance, the collapse of Russia could encircle China from the north. If China disintegrates, Russia would be vulnerable from the southeast. Similarly, the fates of Iran and North Korea would become precarious. Therefore, for the Western alliance to achieve ultimate victory, it must go beyond military strikes and exert pressure through economic, diplomatic, intelligence, and psychological means, both externally and internally, until the axis of evil crumbles. This prolonged tug-of-war tests the endurance, determination, and wisdom of both sides. Israel's strong counterattack against Hamas is a strategic move in the broader Middle Eastern and global geopolitical game. In the coming period, intensified competition will revolve around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. the Iranian nuclear issue, and the Syrian civil war, among other issues. The conflicts in Ukraine, the Taiwan Strait situation, and the North Korean nuclear issue will also become significant variables influencing the overall picture. Subsequent impact and outlook. Rafah is likely home to crucial Hamas assets, including various documents and data. The intelligence gathered there could uncover extensive networks, including funding sources and lists of terrorists and infiltrators in the West, while countries like Saudi Arabia, Hamas, Hezbollah, and some EU nations publicly oppose Israel's attack on Rafah. Even President Biden initially urged restraint. However, after discussions with Netanyahu, the White House tacitly accepted Israel's move, and now Rafah is under Israeli control. Biden's shift from opposition to tacit approval was driven by the desire to obtain the list of globally dispersed terrorists hidden in Rafah. For the free world, any place left uncleaned will allow terrorism to resurface. Otherwise, in a few years, the infiltration by Russia and China will worsen, corrupting the younger generation and weakening the counterterrorism efforts. Israel's operation in Gaza is not just a large-scale counterterrorism action, but a well-orchestrated geopolitical strategy. By dismantling Hamas's foundations, reshaping Gaza's order, and China-Russia influence in the Middle East, Israel aims to achieve multiple goals. The Rafah battle is a pivotal step in reshaping the Middle Eastern order. Controlling Gaza and weakening Hamas not only removes a significant security threat, but also significantly alters the regional power dynamics. Countries like Egypt and Qatar may call for ceasefire publicly, but their interests are varied, and they cannot sway Israel's firm resolve. Egypt, as a third party in the Gaza issue, has long been maneuvering between Hamas and Israel. While it publicly calls for a ceasefire, it secretly supplies Hamas with weapons through tunnels into Gaza. This has greatly displeased Israel, leading to direct artillery strikes on Egyptian border posts, warning Cairo against getting too close to China. Egypt itself faces numerous challenges. The Suez Canal's disruption due to the conflict has caused severe economic losses. A potential collapse of Gaza, leading to a refugee influx, would exacerbate the situation. With China's leading diplomatic efforts for a ceasefire, Egypt is in a difficult position, making token gestures while allowing some Hamas fighters to escape to Egypt through tunnels. Real mediation by Egypt would depend on how much tangible investment and food aid China and Russia can offer. Saudi Arabia, although not officially allied with Israel, shares some common interests. The U.S. is looking to sign a security agreement with Saudi Arabia, pushing for normalized relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel while weakening China's influence in Saudi Arabia. However, this is easier said than done, with significant obstacles and opposition within the U.S. Congress over arms sales to Saudi Arabia due to concerns about weapons proliferation and human rights issues. This indicates that on the Gaza issue, Saudi Arabia's stance is more about maintaining appearances while staying neutral and observing from the sidelines. Hamas has suffered heavy losses in this conflict, with significant damage to its strength. Israel has destroyed many of Hamas's military facilities in Gaza, cut off its financial sources, and undermined its popular support. As the last stronghold in Rafah is taken, Hamas's rule in Gaza is on the verge of collapse. However, Israel is well aware of Hamas's resilience and will not be complacent. Moving forward, Israel will adopt a dual strategy of military administration and reconstruction to completely eliminate any remaining Hamas elements and comprehensively rebuild Gaza politically, economically, and socially. For Israel, Gaza is just the beginning. The Middle Eastern chessboard is ever-changing, with every move impacting the entire region. Israel will need to address potential threats from Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah, manage delicate relationships with Arab nations, and find balance in the power struggle among global superpowers. As the pioneer in this high-stakes gamble, Israel understands the immense responsibility it carries. Only by decisively eradicating terrorism and wisely reshaping the Middle East can Israel truly win this existential battle. Israel's strong retaliation against Hamas is strategic for the broader Middle Eastern and global geopolitical game. The coming period will see intensified competition around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Iranian nuclear issue, and the Syrian civil war, among other issues. Only by carefully assessing the situation and adapting strategies accordingly can one seize the initiative in the chaos and ultimately secure victory.